Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Cultivating Success webinar. Today's webinar is on best practices for farmers markets and farm stands during this time of COVID-19. Cultivating Success is a program that's a partnership of University of Idaho Extension, the nonprofit organization Rural Roots, and the WSU Food Systems Program. Today's presenter is Faith Critzer. She's a produce safety extension specialist at Washington State University. I'm Colette DePhelps. I will be your moderator today. I'm an area extension educator in community food systems with University of Idaho. Just a couple of webinar tips when we get started. I know that a lot of people are watching this webinar from home and you might have some problems with your bandwidth. If that is the case, it might be helpful to close other programs running on your computer. If at any time the sound becomes slow or garbled, you can go ahead and type into the chat box at the bottom of your screen in your control bar and ask whether or not that is with the system itself or perhaps on your side. If it is on your side, at any time you can switch to the phone. Please type questions for Faith into the question box and we'll have time at the end of the webinar to answer those questions. If you registered before about 9:30 a.m. Pacific this morning, I sent slide handouts to you in 2 different versions, and that was through your email. So one version had 1 slide per slide for ease of viewing, and the other had 4 slides per handout page so that they would be easier to print. Both of those will be posted with the recording on the website at cultivatingsuccess.org, and I'll show you exactly where those will be at the end of today's webinar. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Faith to share hers. And there you go. We see you're logged in.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today, and thanks to Colette for giving me the opportunity to connect with you all. I think that we're really facing, as has been said over and over again, unprecedented times, is trying to strategize how to keep on operating as best we can in light of COVID-19 and the various ramifications we're trying to put in place specifically around social distancing and sanitizing things. So we'll talk through that as well as some strategies towards the end as for all you market managers out there who are just trying to figure out what's the best way to run your market. Some food for thought there. Maybe I have to do this. So what's on docket? We're going to basically talk through some strategies for managing risk. As a food microbiologist and an extension professional who works primarily with the produce industry, that's a lot of what I do every day in my job. Typically, we're talking about foodborne illness. This case, however, we're talking about something that makes other people sick from person-to-person transmission. But fortunately for us, a lot of the things that we're doing are already protective measures, meaning it helps reduce our risk that we're already doing for food safety as it relates to COVID-19. So we'll talk through a lot of cleaning and specifically more so sanitizing, look through what are our options there for sanitizers, what are the pros and cons in each, and then touch very briefly on worker health and hygiene programs. Hand hygiene, as everybody knows, has been really hit hard as far as one of the primary ways we can try and prevent illness as well. The last thing we're going to go through is some strategies, as I said before, just trying to, figure out how you can potentially run your market and what is being done in other parts of the United States. So please keep in mind that this is a very new virus. It is being studied around the world. We're going to have new information emerging over the coming months. So it's really important, as you're doing today, to stay engaged and trying to keep up to date if there is new information that we find out. We're going to be discussing different management strategies based upon our current knowledge. Again, you are listening in is because your role in a large part is many times as a risk manager. So you're going to take that information and try and determine how you're actually going to manage risk, either within your own farmers markets booth, or if you're a farmers market manager, the market as a whole, or your roadside stand. So just to give us all a little bit of COVID-19 baseline, basically this is a virus. Viruses are unique, that unlike bacteria, a virus cannot grow outside of the host. That means it cannot increase in numbers. But what it can do is sit on a surface until it can make someone else ill. So a lot of our sanitizing strategies, even if it's our hands or surfaces that we're commonly touching, are around trying to inactivate that virus if it does happen to be placed there. The virus that causes COVID-19 is called SARS-CoV-2. And this is basically a type of virus that is newly developed and is what we call zoonotic, meaning it made the jump from animals to humans. And so it's something that our immune systems have never seen, and thus the really high infectivity rates. It's part of the coronavirus family, which has thousands of viruses that make up this family. Most of them are associated with upper respiratory illnesses. A little bit of background, just because it's referenced in some of the EPA guidance around sanitizers, it is what we call an envelope virus, meaning that it does have this outer membrane with it, and it is an RNA-based virus. Some viruses have DNA, this one happens to have RNA, but in essence, it's just a shell, and what it has to do when it infects us is it actually has to kind of hijack our cells' or our cells' own mechanisms for replicating itself. So that's a virus in a nutshell. Again, how are we getting sick with this virus? It's being transmitted through respiratory droplets. And so in essence, we can be made ill by either inhaling those respiratory droplets or by touching surfaces where those droplets have landed. And typically we're looking for people that are then going to go and touch either their eyes or nose or mouth, where we have a lot of mucous membranes that are able to act as sites where that virus can then infect us. We also see that we have some transmission reported from what we call asymptomatic individuals, which means these people are not showing visible signs of illness. They don't have a cough, they're not running a fever, and yet they're still putting these respiratory droplets out into the environment, and they're excreting them, which is kind of problematic because it doesn't help us contain everything fully by just focusing on ill individuals. And last bit I'll touch on is that there's no evidence that it is being transmitted via food. So again, we don't really look at needing to take steps as far as food that comes to market, anything special from what we're normally doing, but we'll talk through a few strategies around trying to protect that food so that it does not become a source of those respiratory droplets being deposited there. So what tools can be used at the market or at your roadside stand? We'll really walk through cleaning and sanitizing our high-touch surfaces. And this is literally, it doesn't have to be a food contact surface. In many instances, it's going to be non-food contact surfaces, but anywhere where individuals are going to be touching. So think about if you're paying with an iPad or something along those lines, that's going to be a high-touch surface. If you have your table there, that's going to be a high-touch surface. And so that's going to be some of those areas where we're going to want to give a little bit of extra love to when it comes to sanitizing them for control of trying to prevent transmission. We're also going to touch very briefly on maintaining hand hygiene, which can be challenging at markets, and talk through some kind of approaches for developing your own kind of makeshift hand washing station there at your stand. And then finally, we'll talk through social distancing and its overall role and how that kind of throws a kink in things when we're talking about trying to run The farmers markets, it's in a large part seen as a very social activity for market goers. So a lot of what I train on is cleaning and sanitizing surfaces. So overall, cleaning and sanitizing are already recognized as key for managing our food safety risk that we have, and our tenet of our good agricultural practices that we're working with on any farm that's growing produce. These practices are also going to be protective, meaning they're going to help reduce our risk tied to SARS-CoV-2, because they're going to also give us a means of inactivating it. So mainly what we're looking for here is against surface sanitation, but not fruit and vegetable surface sanitation. The main thing we want to think about when we're thinking about cleaning and sanitizing is that clean does not mean sanitize. These are two different steps. Cleaning is the removal of all visible soil. And that really allows us to have pretty much a clean slate. For when we apply our sanitizer, it's really going to be able to target whatever little bit of soil may be remaining, in addition to those microorganisms like the SARS-CoV-2 virus that we may be trying to target if it happens to be there. So by sanitizing, we're really creating that hygienic environment through the reduction of microorganisms. So we have a compound that we're applying, and we'll walk through a lot of different classes of sanitizers. Again, so that's where we'll spend a lot of our day to day. Again, sanitation should be thought of as kind of that invisible barrier against foodborne illness, but it also works in the very same way if our sanitizer also targets this virus. So to start with, first things first, the purpose of cleaning is to remove soil, food, and any other organic matter from a surface so that sanitizer can actually better target the microorganisms like the virus that we're targeting. Typically, we have two different approaches we can take. We have wet cleaning, which is where we're using water to clean that surface. And we can either apply wet cleaning with just water alone, or with water in addition to a detergent followed by a rinse. Excuse me. That detergent does allow us to remove some more soil than would be there normally. And we've all cleaned things several times over, so you know that you have to apply pressure in one way or another. So many of us will be using mechanical action when we go in and scrub things with a brush or things along those lines. So generally speaking, that is wet cleaning in a nutshell. Most people have pretty good idea around how to conduct wet cleaning because they've been doing it in some way, shape, or form their entire life. For dry cleaning, what we're really looking to do there is we have a surface that doesn't normally get wet. That is really important for us to consider because it may have electronics there that are, vulnerable to getting wet, or the materials that it's made of may actually absorb and take on water, which would not be very good for us. Other reasons is if we have a dry environment, as far as bacteria goes, we tend to try and keep it dry because if we start adding water, that may give our bacteria some opportunity for growth. So with dry cleaning, essentially what we're trying to do is sweep or brush or wipe without water to remove that soil load. So again, then when we apply our sanitizer, it is able to do its job. I would say, these are two approaches we commonly take into reference for surfaces that have soil on them. Some of your high touch surfaces that you're going to be going through and sanitizing, you're going to be doing this so frequently, they probably aren't going to have a lot of soil present. But for those things that do, this would be our two cleaning approaches that we would want to see instilled first before we move on to a sanitizer. So when it comes to sanitizing, we're really trying to inactivate our target microorganisms that could be on a surface that can make someone ill. With these, we have several different categories, and I've put the 5 most commonly encountered ones up here on the slide deck. And we'll walk through each of these later on today. But our first one is oxidizers. And so many of the compounds that we've been using most frequently fall within this group. Things like chlorine, whether it be sodium hypochlorite from a liquid bleach solution, or some of our sanitizers that we commonly use for washing fruits and vegetables, like peroxyacetic acid. That is like the Sanidate is one of the trade names for that product, and a little bit less frequently used, but still very effective, chlorine dioxide. In our next category, we have ammonia compounds or quaternary ammonia compounds. And a lot of times we just shorten these to quats when we're talking about them. And so we'll go through those compounds if you're not familiar with them. Alcohol is one that is very widely used, and a lot of times in combination actually with quaternary ammonia compounds. So most of our hand sanitizers, for instance, have alcohol base in them with a little bit of quaternary ammonia compounds in them as well. Alcohol, the nice thing about it is it evaporates, especially if we have those dry surfaces that we're trying to keep dry, then an alcohol is a very nice sanitizer because it will evaporate off that surface and not remain wet over time. The last two are UV light that we'll talk through, and then temperature, because a lot of people have questions around how do they use temperature as a sanitizing step. With UV light, that takes a special type of light that has to be exposed to a surface, and we'll walk through some of the nuances of that, in addition to temperature, where in essence we have steam or hot water that we're applying. The big key there is, though, that we're trying to get those surfaces to 160 degrees Fahrenheit for real sanitizing activity. So let's start talking first about our oxidizers. For our oxidizers, we're going to have our most common oxidizer that we will use is chlorine, and that will most commonly be in the form of liquid bleach is how we reference it commonly, but that real technical name is sodium hypochlorite. Calcium hypochlorite is a little bit less frequently used in small and medium scale operations, but calcium hypochlorite, if you have a pool, is what we use in many of our pools, and this is just a tablet form that we can get chlorine in. With both of these, they're diluted into water, and then you have an acid which forms, which is actually going to inactivate our microorganisms. Peroxyacetic acid, or PAA, is probably our next most frequently used within this category. And PAA is actually a mixture of peroxyacetic acid, hydrogen peroxide, and as well as acetic acid. So within that, we have these three compounds coming together, and they have a really strong activity against a wide range of microorganisms. Hydrogen peroxide, a little bit less frequently used, but we have seen some uses of it in some sanitizers labeled that use only hydrogen peroxide. And then chlorine dioxide, finally, which is actually, again, another example where we actually mix two things together, and you do that actually on site, and then it's diluted in water, and that will form chlorine dioxide. So these compounds oxidize components of microorganisms to inactivate, or AKA kill them. And so with the virus, this is exactly what we would be doing. So we're essentially going to go in and oxidize the outer envelope of this virus, and hopefully also basically make it where it's not going to be infective any longer. The downside to these is they also oxidize everything that they're going to interact with. This is going to include soil, plant matter, any equipment. So if we have like a cardboard or plywood or something along those lines, those are clearly have a lot of organic matter with them. And they'll also oxidize electronics. So with this in mind, if you have a soiled surface, this makes cleaning that surface first key. And why we always preface that as the first tenet. Now with COVID-19, again, as I said, we're going to see a lot of people really sanitizing very frequently, so you may not get that soil buildup over time. But if you do, it does make cleaning a very important first step. So the things that are important within this is to use the appropriate concentration. and use the appropriate contact time. With any sanitizer, those are always our two key factors that we're considering. So what's my concentration and what's my contact time that I should be shooting for? Again, the EPA label is going to provide us that information. And if you can't find an EPA label, you can look them up on the internet, and we can go through some resources that you can utilize to actually look at that information, and if you don't have that label on hand. Essentially, the EPA registers all sanitizers. They're registered as an antimicrobial pesticide product. Unless they are a pesticide device. A UV light is an example of a pesticide device, but everything else should have an EPA label that accompanies it. So with our quaternary ammonia compounds, these again are a wide range of compounds that are all categorized in this one group because they have different groups basically that can be substituted in. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor here, but they can be substituted in. So these are examples of what's on the screen down here at the bottom is examples of benzalkonium chloride, which are some of our more frequently used quaternary ammonia compounds. The things that fall into this category generally speaking, have a positive charge. The beauty with how they work with microorganisms is that microorganisms, our target that we're trying to kill, has a slight negative charge. So we're actually getting a kind of like magnets, right? They're attracted to one another. So they're attracted to this compound. And then essentially this compound will come in and cause cell disruption, meaning that it will die and cannot infect other people. The thing that I like about quats is that they do leave a coating on a surface. So if any of you all have been using like some of the sanitizing wipes, and after you use them, you'll wipe things down and you'll notice there's a film there. Well, that film is actually the quaternary ammonia compound within that wipe. And that film is actually still has the sanitizer present, and it will continue to work while it is still present until it gets wiped away, basically. The other nice thing about compared to our oxidizers is that quaternary ammonia compounds are not as corrosive to equipment and electronics as our oxidizers are. The big thing though to keep in mind with quaternary ammonia compounds, they're not permitted in organic production without a potable water rinse. For any of you who are getting organic certified, you'll want to have a conversation with your organic certifier around maybe some other areas you may be sanitizing that are not food contact areas at all, and walk through that with them if you're using this on farm. But as far as like high touch surfaces within the market, it should be completely fine. Alcohol, again, there's a lot of different alcohol types. What we typically see used within sanitizer capacity for surfaces is either an isopropanol or an ethanol-based formulation. Again, typically keeping somewhere between 60 to 90% in those formulas is going to give us optimal antimicrobial activity. So we don't want it too low, or we may basically dilute to the point where it's not going to inactivate that cell. Again, we typically use these preferentially in areas which should be maintained dry, such as our computer interfaces and other electronics, or any of our dry packing equipment if we have a crop that we're trying to not get wet. And this would be a good sanitizer there. So again, they're oftentimes mixed with quaternary ammonia compounds. So it's really important to make sure you get a quat-free formula if you're using these on food contact surfaces within organic production. And again, just have that conversation with your certifier ahead of time. If it's not a food contact service, again, it should not be as big of an issue. I had a few questions come up over the past couple of weeks around UV light. Normally I wouldn't put it into the slide deck, but given that I was receiving these questions, I wanted to get some information out there so you know how UV lights work and how they do not work. So UV light is the spectrum of light that, of course, we cannot see. We are specifically targeting a little section within the spectrum called UVC, and that is what gives us our germicidal range. So that 254 nanometers that I've referenced right there is really our optimal wavelength for us getting microbial inactivation. So inactivating the virus would come optimally at that wavelength. What happens here is it actually causes cross-linking of RNA and DNA, and that will kill the cell. So it's only going to sanitize, though, the surfaces the light actually touches. And that may sound fine to you initially, but everything has little nooks or crannies where basically a shadow will protect it when you expose it to this light. It's also really important to know that it will cause damage to eyes as well as skin. So whenever we apply UV light, we really make sure that we do not have people anywhere around when it is being exposed. The picture here is actually a picture from a biosafety hood we use in the food micro lab, and we use a UV light to stare as one of our sterilization steps. We also use a quaternary ammonia compound followed by alcohol, then the UV light as a final step. But know that we're working with foodborne pathogens in these surfaces, so it's nice to have some redundancy. But with that, we pull a sash down. That sash stays down so that UV light cannot make its way out, and therefore we're protected. So I'm not sure that this is a really great mechanism. Although you can find them on the market, I don't think they're going to do as great a job as you think, given that we shouldn't expose people to them while we're sanitizing. While this is not a pesticide product, it is a pesticide device, and therefore any manufacturer should have an EPA establishment number associated with them, and the product that you're buying is something to look out for. So temperature is our other thing that we can apply that is outside of the realm of an actual chemical compound that can also have some sanitizing efficacy if we can get the temperature high enough. So I would say this treatment type is typically the most demanding to apply. And there are a few reasons because of that. Most surfaces with a plastic component or electronics are not designed to withstand these temperatures. Equipment has to be built with this in mind, right? And most of our equipment just is not rated to be heated to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. It's also demanding, even if everything else above checks out okay. It's also really demanding to maintain temperature uniformly at that high a temperature. Typically, we're talking about applying like anywhere around like 180 to 170, 165 at least temperature water, to be able to get that surface to 160. So it's real easy to drain your hot water tanks. And again, I would say this really should be used, I would use preferentially for laundering any washable surfaces. Again, your sanitize cycle of most washing machines are going to boost that internal temperature to 165 degrees Fahrenheit, and most of them hold it anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes, which should be sufficient to inactivate this virus. So you're all probably thinking, great, Faith, I'm glad I've gotten my chemistry lesson today on sanitizers, but I'm still not quite sure what I would want to use at the market. And so here's some considerations. We'll actually take you through a few tools that you can use to look up your sanitizers or kind of see what's out there if you're shopping around for a sanitizer. So the first thing to ask yourself is, it is a compound that we're adding either directly or through a dilution to a surface. Does it have that EPA registration number? Again, we're going to want to see that EPA registration number because that allows us to both look up the label if it's not affixed to the container, as well as use the EPA's tool for looking at sanitizers which have been approved for fighting COVID-19. Again, you'll use that EPA label to determine key criteria for application. They'll walk through the concentration that you will want to have that sanitizer at. Some sanitizers are ready to use right out of the bottle. Others take dilution. And then what contact time should that sanitizer have with that surface before it goes on to further use. The last thing that that label will talk about is what organisms it will work against. And sometimes the labels are very general and they talk about all microorganisms. It would be helpful if we saw, even though we don't expect any label to address COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 directly, we would like to see them treating viruses such as coronavirus specifically, and then some others may talk about treating viruses such as norovirus as an alternative for some of our more food-geared sanitizers. But we would want to see that it actually has activity against the organism that we're interested in, which is going to be within that coronavirus family. You're going to see within these labels, they will have separate instructions for sanitizing food contact and non-food contact surfaces. And typically the difference that we see is that the concentration actually goes up on non-food contact surfaces. And that is because we are essentially don't have any risk of having residual carryover of that sanitizer into that food product. And so typically we have lower concentrations used on anything that's considered a food contact surface. Just for those in the audience, for a food contact surface, we're actually looking at anything that that food's going to come in contact with. So any packaging, any bins or harvesting tools or anything along those lines should all be considered a contact surface. For our UV, oh yeah.
We have a question, Faith, and what about vinegar?
Vinegar does not have a label, that EPA pesticide label. And while, if you had vinegar in a high enough concentration, and so acetic acid is the acid there. If you had it in a high enough concentration, theoretically it could work. But the problem is that we don't have the scientific studies to show at what that concentration is, or what that contact time needs to be. For companies, when they're applying for these labels, they actually have to show their scientific studies that prove that these work. And so for using products that are off-label or not registered as sanitizers, then in essence, we have a really tough time trying to give any sort of recommendation. So you could be treating with something, it's not going to work as a sanitizer. And so it's not a really great use of our resources because you may not
Okay.
be getting the job done. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So for moving on from our sanitizers that we're looking at that EPA label from, again, that UV light's going to have that EPA establishment number, and then that light manufacturer will also give you directives around how much time exposure the light, like how long does the light need to be on within a given surface for it to work effectively. So the things that you would want to think through are what areas are high priority for cleaning and or sanitation. As I said before, sanitization, if you're doing it frequently, you may not have to have that cleaning step prior. Again, look at anything that is frequently touched by employees or vendors, and then also our market guests as something that needs to be on that list. And then start developing that list so that you can check it off and in essence keep those surfaces sanitized on a very routine basis. The other thing I would start asking myself is, what compound do I currently use as a sanitizer in my operation? So what do I have at my disposal? Typically we're buying these things in at least a gallon, if not 5-gallon aliquot. So if the sanitizer I have that I'm using already on farm fits the bill, then that's probably going to be the easiest thing that I have to implement, unless it is it's not going to be conducive for sanitizing a surface like an electronic or something along those lines. The thing to ask yourself, do you currently have a written program for cleaning or sanitizing surfaces? And if not, then developing those written programs so that they are in writing, because it's not just you helping out at your stand. You may have somebody filling in from day to day, or there may be normally more people than just yourself there. So it keeps everybody on the same page as far as what are the expectations, given that this is all so brand new, and it'll give you a tool to actually help train them, because you'll give them basically verbal instructions. They'll be able to read your written instructions, and then you'll make sure can they actually adhere to the policy you've developed. The other thing I would be asking myself when I'm targeting surfaces is this a contact surface, right? A food contact surface. If it is, we'll want to be cognizant of the fact that we do not want to use those sanitizers in a more concentrated form, because again, the risk there is that we could get some carryover between. So again, there has probably the best resource for us that we have right now is the EPA list in for disinfectants for use against SARS-CoV-2. This link will take you there, and I will share a few screenshots that I made for purposes of going through this tool so you know how to utilize it for your operation. So when we look on the website, there's going to be a search function basically where we can put in our compound. So if you currently have a sanitizer, you need to look up that EPA registration number, and you can type it in here then to the first column. That number is going to basically pull it up through their database of sanitizers that have already been registered with the EPA as far as having efficacy against SARS-CoV-2. If you do not currently have a sanitizer and are on the flip side shopping for sanitizers, then you can look based upon category. And so these active ingredients are those compounds we went through. So quaternary ammonia compounds, alcohol, chlorine, or peroxyacetic acid would all be examples of things that you could search for here in the active ingredients toolbar. What will come up when you do get a match is all of these other things here where it will talk through the product's name, it will go through the manufacturing company. As per the EPA label, it will give you an indication as far as how you should follow the directions on that label. And so in essence there, a lot of times these will reference another virus, such as something in the coronavirus family, or maybe something outside of that family like norovirus, that product may have already been labeled for, but it will tell you there specifically. And then essentially it's giving you the contact time in minutes. So you can go and look up what concentration you should be hitting here, and then what your contact time looks like. So again, this is just going through and walking through so everybody sees this twice. So in our first column, we're going to look up our EPA registration number for any products you currently have on hand. And then secondly, if we don't have any products on hand, what active compound do you want to use? So here are our search terms that we could put in: sodium hypochlorite, peroxyacetic acid, hydrogen peroxide, quaternary ammonia, and isopropanol or ethanol are all terms that we could search for within our active ingredients. Other things that we would want to think about are high-touch surface management. And so I would say, if you're sitting in your role now, I would start to think about how many things can I eliminate as a high-touch surface that maybe if I was running the market the way I did last season, I can now just take those and phase them out. And that's probably going to give us the fewest number of things we have to focus on, and as far as sanitizing, and give us the highest likelihood of success. We also are seeing a lot of disruption within our supply chain, and sanitizers have been disrupted almost as much as toilet paper, right? So a lot of people are having really tough time getting a hold of sanitizer. So when you do, you're going to want to be very conservative with how it's being used, right? So that you can get the most out of it until that supply chain pressure is alleviated. So the other things we would want to think about here are We want to preferentially use non-porous surfaces. Those would be things like hard plastic or stainless steel or painted metal. And we would try and eliminate some things like tablecloths and things along those lines in the long run, unless they are plastic. Again, another thing to think about is sampling should be phased out while we're managing COVID-19, is one of the big recommendations that's really pertinent to farmers markets. I know that sampling is a great way to sell your product, but just the nuances of sampling, it creates too many high-touch surfaces and actually kind of feeds into aggregating. So that's one of the rationales behind while we're trying to tell people to phase it out. Again, if you're a market manager, try and make sure that all of their surfaces have a management plan for sanitization, such as restrooms and hand washing facilities for the market, coins or tokens, which are used for farmers market currency in some markets, as well as those tablets and phones that are used at the booths to process credit card payments. Here we see a display that was taken several years ago, right? But this shows a really nice barrier this vendor put in place to really try and prevent, our patrons from actually being able to have contact with the product. So they're managing all the product. The patrons, though, can still see the product that they're purchasing, and so they can make their decisions as appropriate. But that's another way you can potentially think through putting up some of these barriers so that we have fewer things we're trying to manage driven by what our patrons are actually coming in contact with. So maintaining hand hygiene, we're making a pretty drastic turn here now in our conversation. This one's going to be a pretty brief discussion around hand hygiene. So the thing to think about when you're actually at market is potable hand washing stations. And so we have an example here that's actually taken at a farmer's market where we have our igloo cooler filled up with potable water. We have our soap up top. They had disposable paper towels. It's almost a little bit out of the shot, but over here in this container. And then they have a bucket for catching their gray water. There, bada boom, bada bing, you have a hand washing station. There are other examples, and I've linked to one right here if you want from the University of Minnesota. So know that you do not have to invest a lot of money in this. But for you as vendor, you're going to need to think about how are my employees going to sanitize their hands if they don't have a hand washing station in the booth. I think it's going to be pretty hard with the amount of times we're asking people to wash their hands. So this is going to be one of the key things we'll kind of want to focus on if you don't already have that as a policy at your booth normally. Again, access to hand sanitizer, again, preferentially after washing hands is when we'd want to see the supply. Again, I would say that applying the sanitizer without washing your hands is better than nothing at all. But again, we're trying to remove some of that soil load and make that sanitizer actually work better. Again, we're targeting greater than 60% alcohol content for these sanitizers. I'm not a big fan of mixing your own because I think that there's too much in the formulation you can get wrong, and equal distribution and things along those lines of the alcohol may be hard for you to manage. If gloves are used, they should be taken off as not to contaminate your hands. And this is basically where you actually try and pop off one glove from the outside, and then you use your clean hand to burrow up underneath the still gloved hand. And so you're never actually touching the outside with that quote unquote clean hand that it was the first one to get the glove off. Now we're going to talk just very briefly on social distancing. So I think this is where most market managers have, and vendors also, in market stands have a real, now's the time to start thinking outside of the box. And I would say that everyone is facing the same situation. So you're doing the right thing. You're tuning into webinars like this to get ideas around some things you should be thinking about. Here's some other resources for you to check out there specific to Idaho and Washington that should be helping out. But this is an example, the picture down at the bottom is an example of a market in North Carolina They're shared for me by an extension professional, Debbie Roos, who's with NC State Extension. And there you can see that they've actually, this has been recently. So they have taken what normally would be vendors right next door to one another, and they split them out so that they can maintain social distancing. Because it's not only, thinking about the one person that maybe they're buying, is what happens if you get a line forming? Where does that line go to? And if you have people too close together, then that's not going to allow for us to keep space the way that we have been recommended, by at least 6 feet. Again, it's going to be challenging in some space constrained markets to maintain that 6-foot social distance. So there's a lot of new models that are being explored throughout the US. The one that's being shown here is again from Debbie. No, actually this was from an article that was an Ohio market where they were doing a drive-through market. And so clearly that's a ton of messaging that has to go out to both your vendors as well as the patrons that shop at that market. But in essence, they were being able to drive through each vendor. Clearly this may take a very long time in some situations if you had a lot, and there could be bottlenecks at some stands versus others, but it was what they were trying out. A lot of people are also trying online platforms that are allowing patrons to select what they would like, and allows the vendors basically to aggregate that material together, and then they can just basically pick it up the day at the market. It also allows you to schedule people when they do come to pick up, so you can space people out accordingly. Again, this is something that takes a lot of work and investment, right, and getting up to speed very quickly, but there's a lot of online platforms that people are looking at moving to across the board for helping with this direct to consumer marketing stream and keeping it healthy over this next growing season. So, oh, sorry there. So if you're thinking as the market manager and wearing that hat, limit the number of vendors to accommodate social distancing guidelines. So that will be one of the first things. The space you have to work within, and the number of people that may come to a market. It may be necessary to actually limit the number of people who can gain entry into the market, right? So you don't crowd the market with too many people all at once. Of course, spacing vendors, or remove or restrict areas where patrons can linger or gather. So some people are taking away picnic tables and things along those lines that were normally part of, what you would encourage people to do. And then overall, just the best plan is to clearly communicate through online presence, signage, or taped walkways, whatever these new policies are. And I would say probably all of those methods to have some redundancy, because some people are not going to be plugged into Facebook or whatever, reading your newsletters that are being pushed out. So when they show up to market, give them a way so that they can be educated very quickly and know what is expected of them. So here are a few resources, and I tried to just give you you're probably used to seeing these over and over again, but here's some for Idaho and Washington, as well as the FDA and CDC, around some guidelines to consider. It's very much the same things that we've been talking through here today, but just may give a little bit more food for thought if you haven't already seen those. And that's all I have for today. It looks like we have some questions here, so.
Yes, we do have some questions.
Awesome.
So if you want, I'll just go ahead and stop sharing your screen and just
Okay.
put up the Cultivating Success slide while we go through the questions. Okay, so let's see. Okay. So just a little background while we go through the questions. So the first question that we have is asking some questions about about alcohol. And this would be the isopropyl alcohol or the
Mhm.
ethanol. And it says various medical professions say 70% is much more effective in disinfecting than 90%. And you just said greater than 60%. Can you provide some clarity on those ranges?
Yeah, so essentially, I was giving it within reference of a product you're going to be buying anyways, right? So when we buy alcohol, it is already formulated and does not need to be diluted typically for buying an alcohol-based product like our hand sanitizers. You know, alcohol will not work very well if it's above 90% because essentially it's too hydrophobic, and it will not interact with the membrane, in our case, the envelope of this virus. So that's why too high a concentration doesn't work well. It's kind of a moot point because alcohol evaporates off through into the air when it's in too high a concentration. So that's the other thing that takes care of that for us typically. But you should buy already formulated sanitizer concentrations. I think there's a lot of risk because the bottle may say something is I don't know, 75% alcohol and you're trying to dilute it down to 65%, but in essence that's the concentration that was in that bottle when it was made, and it has probably lost some concentration over time and you're not going to know that. So that is one thing that gives me qualms when I hear people recommending, make up their own sanitizers and things along those lines, that we don't really know what concentration we're working with in that bottle we may be diluting. So, yep. And then when it comes to actual concentration, when we're between that 60 to 90% range, it really depends upon the virus that we're targeting. And so I would say that most of our hand sanitizers are formulated somewhere around 65 to 75% for activity of the alcohol, but they have the studies in hand to show that that actually works against the viruses and bacteria and whatever else they may be targeting.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Kind of moving from that into talking a little bit more about gloves, we have a question about if you could give some more information on the proper use of gloves.
Yeah. From when I train people on food safety, I tell them that I think gloves give a lot of people a false sense of security, because I don't think they're as in touch with the surfaces that they're touching and may not realize when those gloves have become soiled. And even observing people who may be utilizing them as a barrier now, like just out in public, I see a lot of them touching their face and their mouth with those gloves, which won't allow them to do their job, right? I would say that if you're going to use gloves as a risk management strategy, just be really in tune to how are you going to manage those gloves. So are you sterilizing the gloves as you use them at the market? Who's taking the money, right? Are you going to take money in gloves and then change those gloves out? Or are you going to try and have more than one person at the market? One person does one job, another person does another job. But either be ready for a lot of glove changing. And as I said, I think the biggest thing when you're changing your gloves is to make sure that you kind of pop off that, and when I say pop off, it means kind of pull up from the outside with your gloved hand, the outside of one glove, and once you get it removed, you take that clean hand, aka, and kind of burrow it under the still gloved hand to kind of roll it inside out, basically. That way you're not coming in contact with whatever is on the outside of that glove. So that's the biggest thing. Using gloves is definitely a strategy that people are picking up, but you can't, you have to use them appropriately. So making sure they're getting changed out as frequently as they need to be to protect yourself in this case, and also make sure you're not maybe cross-contaminating with your vendors, right? And when you're interacting with them.
Thank you for that. And just to follow up, delving a little bit more into the payment options, we have a couple questions about this. And you did mention, you could be in a situation where, as the vendor, you are both managing the produce and the payment. I know a number of markets are now asking that vendors have somebody designated for payments and somebody that's designated to work with the food. If you were in a situation where you don't have two people, how would you suggest handling that rotation?
Yeah, so there's a few ways you can do this, and it's going to take a lot of work on your part as the vendor to get good at them. And you're probably going to mess up a lot when you first start. But if you don't have two people, the other thing we can do is work with what we call clean hand, dirty hand. And in essence, we can have one hand, which is going to be touching those surfaces that are more likely to have risk of virus, right? So if you're taking money, right, or interacting with that iPad or whatever you're processing payment, or your phone, whatever you're processing payments on, that hand then does those jobs, and the other hand will do the things like touch produce and things along those lines. It gets really hard though, because for some jobs you just need more than one hand. And so that's clearly our limitation. Like, you may need to get some things to help facilitate. For instance, if you bag out, are you going to start using some sort of bag to put produce in and then give that to your customers? Then can you have something that holds that bag open, right? So you can, in theory, do things all with one hand. So it's going to take, a lot of work on your part. But the other thing that I've heard a few articles mention is vendors actually partnering up. I kind of say that with a lot of hesitation, because in theory they shouldn't be close together. But I have heard a few instances where vendors basically paired up, and one would handle the money and the other would handle pulling the product. Again, I say that with a bit of hesitation because they're not socially distancing in that case, but that would be something else that a few have tried.
So ultimately, it would be better to have somebody within your, I call it the social distancing pod, to be able to take them for you, and then somebody else be, like yourself, focusing on the produce.
Right.
And you brought up a really good point about having some type of bags or containers that you're going to pack that produce into. What would your suggestion be for people who generally have customers that bring their own bags?
Yeah, the risk is there is that you don't know how those bags have been handled in general. Again, I would say that a lot of people may be looking at using a secondary container, is what I would call it, to put into those vendors' bags. Again, we haven't seen a ton of, nobody's done research on this, right? So, what's the risk of a canvas bag that somebody may bring to market with them having COVID or SARS-CoV-2 on it? It's depending upon a lot of variables. The risk of you getting transfer onto your hands, typically we don't see great viral transfer if we're talking a dry surface to a dry surface. So if you're taking your dry hand and handling that dry canvas bag, we wouldn't see there typically being a lot of virus transfer risk. So if you're going to be taking in vendors' bags and still packing produce in it, I would just make sure to sanitize your hands very well after you give that bag back to them, and also probably limit the amount of space that, like, you actually set the bag down or anything along those lines.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Another question about sanitizing, and how would that look if you are using your phone or your iPad or some other electronic device for sales? How would you sanitize between those different transactions, or would you?
Yeah, so I would, if I would as a best practice. The approach that would probably work best is to use one of the wipe type products, is probably going to be easiest. And then if you don't have access to a wipe type product, you can basically take your own paper towels, soak them in your sanitizer, and use that as, so you're not immersing that surface in a lot of water, but yet getting that, the very top of that surface nice and sanitized. But
Great.
if you can get your hands on them, probably the wipe type products would be best.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then we have another question about how should cash sales be handled at market?
Yeah, you know, again, most people are trying to limit cash payment wherever they can. But if you are having cash sales still at market, then I would again work on how are you going to handle that cash. And so look at basically having that one person who handles the cash and is not touching product or other services, and that's kind of their one job to manage that risk. As far as what happens to the cash after you take it in, I have, quite frankly, I have not looked for any ways of sanitizing money or anything along those lines, but I would say, again, looking at risk, normally really dry surfaces to really dry surfaces, we don't get a lot of virus transfer. Now we all know that money may not always be dry, or our hands may not always be dry, so that doesn't always hold up. But in general, I would just try and manage risk within the market as a whole by having one person dedicated to handling money.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another suggestion from one of our viewers about using checks. So being on a protocol where in lieu of cash sales, you would accept a check so that that is minimizing the handling of the paper or the coin. Another question that we have is, what about mask use at market or at farm stands?
Yeah, the mask use is really to try and curtail if someone happens to be an asymptomatic spreader of this virus, or if someone is just starting to get sick and not realizing it. So that is really the benefit of using masks. They're not really going to be protective for the public, right? They're not going to protect the person wearing the mask. They're going to hopefully, if that person happens to be contagious, they're going to prevent, hopefully in a large part, them actually spreading those respiratory droplets, at least with the masks that are commonly available now. So again, just knowing that, I would say that markets have a decision to make upon if they're going to require patrons and vendors to wear masks. It is a policy that the CDC's put out since last week, right? As far as a management strategy, but it's really not going to be protective to the person wearing the mask, which I think a lot of people thought was what its job was. They're really trying to prevent people who may be asymptomatic or just starting to come down with the virus from spreading it to people around them. So I would say decide on what your policy is going to be as a market, and then if you're going to require people to wear masks, have someone basically checking to make sure that is actually occurring and communicate that well in advance.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question about sanitizing wooden EBT or SNAP tokens.
Mm-hmm.
How would somebody go about sanitizing a wooden token?
Yeah, so we would look on the sanitizer EPA label, and we would basically pick up their instructions for sanitizing non-food contact surfaces. So while wood is not a great surface to try and sanitize, we do have that as a common surface we're trying to work with, this non-food contact. So I would follow those non-food contact concentrations, which again should be higher than our other concentrations for food contact surfaces. But I would follow their directions exactly. Typically, the contact time may be much longer, so you may actually need to soak the tokens And again, it may not be very conducive to the overall lifespan of the tokens at the end of the day, but it's what we have to do for public safety in the meantime. Some people I have seen start to go to paper. I know the risk around people replicating paper and things along those lines, but that is a few markets I've seen have started to look at paper options, which they can dispose of so that they don't have that risk maybe posed by tokens.
Yes, yes. Our local market is looking at some different options other than using those wooden tokens with paper, with perhaps a runner or a call to a vendor to let them know, or a text to the vendor to let them know that something is coming to their stand that has been
Yeah.
approved. So just thinking about those inner market communication. Okay, another question that we have is, do you have any ideas for social distancing at a U-Pick farm or best practices at a U-Pick farm?
Yeah, so the thing there is that you'll need to be able to maintain 6 feet, right? It doesn't change just because we're outside versus inside. So only letting in the number of patrons. Um, and I would say maybe even thinking about designing your U-Pick so that basically those patrons are assigned a slot and so they know where they're going to have to remain, and that will allow you to spread things out a bit more and really look at helping air things out. I'm sorry, there's somebody at my door. I'm not going to leave for long, but let me go and see because I'm getting a few. Let me see what they need, okay?
Okay,
Okay.
sure.
Bye-bye.
These are some of the opportunities and challenges from working from home, that there's some things that are often going on in the background. So just addressing one of the other written questions about a cloth soaked with sanitizer working for wipe down of electronics. That is something that Faith talked about very briefly, is that if you don't have the commercial wipes, that you could have your sanitizer and use a paper towel, a clean paper towel that you would soak in between, and then use that to wipe down your equipment. Again, you're going to want to look at the label for that sanitizer and make sure that you are using it and have contact with that service for the wipe down. So if you can find those commercial hand wipes, that is definitely the best thing to do.
Hey, I'm back.
So
Sorry about
for
that.
when Faith gets Okay, great. Not a problem. We have two final questions, and they're really kind of asking the same thing. So I'll
Okay.
combine them into one. And the question is sunlight an effective sanitizer between markets for things such as containers, tablecloths, or those wooden tokens?
Yeah, sunlight. Okay, so sunlight does have some UV light coming with it. The problem is it's not controlled enough for us to use it as a sanitation step, right? Because the penetration of UV light here where I live in the Columbia Basin is probably gonna be totally different than where some people may be living within Idaho, right? And we're not able to predict that, and so we're not able to give people a common strategy. Generally speaking, sunlight also helps desiccate or dry out a surface, and a lot of times, like for all the studies that you've seen are along the lines of it takes 3 days for this virus to dry out on cardboard or something along those lines. That is because, and to die, that is because it's actually drying out within those 3 days. And so after a certain point, it's just not going to be effective at infecting people. So I would say by leaving things outdoors, it's not going to hurt anything, but I would not rely upon that as my sanitation step because we just cannot guarantee it at the end of the day. And so the drier you can make things, the better off you are. But really applying that sanitation step is going to give you pretty good assurance that you've kind of taken that virus if it happened to be on a surface and inactivated it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then thinking about even the sunlight and having things outside for a few days, you might be introducing other pathogens of concern while
Right.
you're trying to address the COVID. So those cleaning and sanitizing steps are really key for controlling all different on different surfaces. Well, with that, thank you. I mean, if you have any
Yes.
final comments that you would like to make, Faith.
No,
uh,
yeah, feel free to follow up with questions, or if people, I think a lot of times it's just knowing, kind of getting an idea about what sanitizers, what sanitation steps they're going to utilize within their operations. So I'm sure most people have been kind of scouring to see what's out there, what they can get from their vendors, but definitely feel free to touch base if anybody has questions afterwards.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm just going to go through where you can find some additional resources and the recording and handouts from this webinar. So if you go to cultivatingsuccess.org and click on the Idaho icon, you are going to come to this page. Webinars, you will find this webinar. Once you click on the name of this webinar to watch the recording, you'll be asked to fill out a Google form, and that will take you to a web page that has both the recorded webinar and it will also have the handouts from today. All of our webinars are on our YouTube channel, so you can also go directly to our YouTube channel. If you do that, though, you won't have any of the linked handouts. So for the slide deck, go ahead and go through our website. We also added this COVID-19 resource button, and it has information on best practices for farmers markets, farm stands. It also talks about how to develop a hand washing station, has several different resources, links to those EPA approved sanitizers and the like. So we encourage you to go to the website, and from this COVID-19 resources link, you can also link to Washington State University's COVID-19 sites. We do have a couple more webinars that are coming up. At 11 o'clock a.m. Pacific, 12 o'clock Mountain, we are going to have a webinar on getting started with community-supported agriculture. We've heard from a number of producers that they're looking to do CSAs this year because they're expecting that their market sales may be down based on some of the access and design challenges for markets. So if you are interested in a CSA, or some of your vendors are, this is a great way to learn more about what it takes to do a CSA. And then following the CSA at 1 o'clock Pacific time, 2 o'clock Mountain, we are going to have a webinar on best practices for farm deliveries, pickups, and CSAs during COVID-19. And Stephanie Smith with Washington State University will be giving that presentation. We've also heard that a large number of people are getting backyard poultry. And so on April 28th, webinar on backyard poultry production. Again, all of these are recorded and they can also be watched live. If you go to this cultivatingsuccess.org webinar series link and register, if you do miss the webinar, you will get an email that tells you where to find that webinar recording and the handouts. We do have a very short post-webinar evaluation that we would appreciate your completing. That is going to launch in your browser when I close the webinar today. If you just take a couple minutes to provide us with some feedback, that will be helpful. And so we really do appreciate your joining us on today's webinar, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Be safe. Thank you.